It's a bit gloomy outside today, but the show must go on. We're gonna do our best. If anyone comments about it, you're homophobic. Bibliophiles of the internet, today I thought I would share my thoughts on 3 recent reads, which all happen to be shorter SFF books. Sometimes I accidentally read on a theme, and that was kind of twofold here since not only are all 3 of these books short fiction, but also all 3 of them are from Tor imprints, 2 being released by the time you see this, and the 3rd one being available by the end of March. So coincidentally, maybe this video will also be helpful for people who are taking part in the Tor.comathon. That was not my intention when making this video, but it's a nice little bonus. So let's just jump right in. First, I read Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This novella came out at the end of last year. It's a queer, historical, supernatural, noir mystery story set in Chicago, and it follows Helen, who made a sort of Faustian deal, exchanging her soul for the lives of people she loves. Well, the expiration date, so to speak, on that deal is coming up very quickly, which isn't great because Helen's girlfriend just got a new job in California, and they want to go live there together and have their happily ever after. But the timing couldn't be worse, especially since Edith, her girlfriend, doesn't know that Helen's time is running short. Helen's also a freelance detective consultant. She has magical powers that often come in handy when uncovering and reading the magical traces left behind on crime scenes, and she gets commissioned by a mysterious benefactor to go photograph those crime scenes. At the beginning of the story, she's offered one last job to help track down a dangerous serial killer, and if she can do this, then she could potentially earn back her soul, and by extension, her freedom, her future, and her happiness. Content warnings include some instances of bloodletting for magical use, but also graphic depictions of blood, gore, corpses, body mutilation, and ritual murders, references to parental death and grief, some references to institutionalization and conversion therapy, as well as the use of outdated ableist language. Somehow this story is able to combine elements of queer history, occult magic, murder mystery, and the eternal struggle between heaven and hell in ways that really appeal to me specifically. To be honest, I think novellas can be hit or miss for so many folks because it's incredibly difficult to tell a good story concisely, to build an entire world in such a short space and not leave any meat on the bone, so to speak. But I think this story is a prime example of really maximizing the novella space, using that brevity to breathe life and imagination into a really intriguing concept, but not leaving the audience feeling like there's still more that needs to be said. I love a good queer historical story, and I love this novella for giving us 2 headstrong queer women living in 1940 Chicago being fully fledged independent human beings with careers and lives and aspirations. I think they also make an interesting crime-fighting, sleuthing duo, which is really fun because it's a dynamic that comes up between them entirely by accident. Helen doesn't normally involve Edith in her work if she can help it, especially if it has to do with demons, but this case puts them together for a change. They're kind of opposites on the moral spectrum. Edith is a well-to-do rising star in radio with her entire life ahead of her. She's also fairly religious. Helen, on the other hand, surrounds herself with dark magic and murder and obviously willingly handed over her soul to demons in a moment of grief. So their relationship is kind of a marriage between lightness and darkness, bridging the gap between those 2 concepts and even forcing the reader to reckon with the fact that heaven and hell might not have as many inherent differences as we like to think. That commentary is very much my jam. I can't say much more about it without spoiling the story, so I won't, but I love it. I love how the story shows both heavenly and demonic forces being in conversation with each other and in some ways fighting to accomplish the same things and each demanding their own forms of sacrifice. I think it's so cool how the story gradually spirals out to be much more ambitious and cinematic than you would expect going into it. There's so many more characters and so many more powerful forces at play than you would anticipate just from the inciting incident in the book. Most importantly, I appreciate the message behind the story, which you can kind of get from the title itself. It's asking that question of whether we would still fight for ourselves or for a future even if the end result may not be perfect, even when the end game and the effort needed to achieve it are hugely disproportionate, even when everything seems hopeless. The book ends for the human experience are life and death. If you knew when things would end, how things would end, that things would end, would you still fight for yourself? What is life and love and futurity worth, even and especially knowing our experiences of those things are finite? It's a great question, and I love that this story is using supernatural, occult, creepy, deeply genre elements in order to pose and thoroughly explore that question and all of its possible answers. Even though this novella is extremely satisfying to read because, as I said, it doesn't leave you wanting for more, I do think there are some small aspects of the world building that either could have been explored further or just excluded completely without changing the overall trajectory of the story. There's this magical brotherhood that's making the investigation harder than it has to be, which is fine, that makes total plot sense, but there's just not enough context for who they are, what they do, or how their magical order works. There's also an astrological element to Helen's magic or knowledge of magic that gets mentioned in the beginning but never really comes back, and I just think that would have been really fucking cool. So yeah, neither of those things are make or break, but they're definitely part of why I ultimately gave this one 4.5 stars and not 5. The next novella I picked up was A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher, which comes out on March 28th, so it will be released by the end of March. This is kind of like a comedy horror story. It blends satire and highly characterized voice with a new and interesting take on the classic setting of a haunted house. In this story, we're following Sam, an entomologist who actually specializes in an archaeological branch of that science, and when the dig she was working on gets delayed, she decides to wait it out by going to stay with her mom, who actually lives in her own late mother's house. Shortly after she gets there, Sam notices that her mom has started redecorating the place in a way that Sam's grandmother would have liked. Everything's very sterile and muted and personal, which is weird because Sam's mom is very much quirky, zany, and eclectic. And her mom has also started reincorporating some more traditional house rules and norms that, again, her deceased mother would have very much liked. And the longer Sam stays, the more strange things seem to get. Content warnings for experienced fat phobia and references to medical discrimination, some references to parental death and grief, some explorations of generational racism and white supremacy, blood, graphic injury, mild body horror, and some mentions of past abuse. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and it did not disappoint. I strongly suspect T. Kingfisher is going to become an all-time favorite author of mine, and while I haven't gotten a chance to read her longer form fiction yet, I will be proven correct if it's anything even remotely, even marginally as good as this. The only other thing I've read from her so far is What Moves the Dead, which is an absolutely stellar and innovative reimagining of a classic Edgar Allan Poe story. And just between that novella and this one, she's already shown an incredible range. I have mentioned more than once when talking about What Moves the Dead how I appreciate the way T. Kingfisher incorporates subtle moments of humor and warmth in that story, which is somewhat unexpected for such a gothic piece. But if the humor was a nice added touch in that novella, here it is very much the centerpiece. A House with Good Bones takes that satirical voice and uses it to tremendous effect. It shouldn't make sense for humor and horror to go together in any kind of overt way, but somehow T. Kingfisher is able to use that satirical element without losing the tension or the ominous foreboding that this kind of story demands. I think some people might consider comedy to be something that would undermine the fear that often defines these kinds of haunted house stories, but I actually found it to be quite a welcome change of pace because what's happening is so subtly terrifying and unsettling that we need someone with Sam's levity to counterbalance that and make it easier to approach. Plus, when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense because most of us, if we were dropped into this kind of situation, would use humor as a way to deflect what's really happening, as a defense mechanism, as a way to reassure ourselves that what's happening can't be real because it's just too ridiculous. It's also kind of interesting that What Moves the Dead is a more classically gothic story, but this novella could also be considered gothic even though it's more modern because one of the defining features of gothic literature is this concept of the present being haunted or eclipsed by the past. That's a theme we see in a lot of haunted house stories, and this one is no exception, but it explores that idea of a place being haunted in new and interesting ways. In some ways, I think the haunting in this story is very subtle and indirect, but it doesn't lose that intensity or impact. For example, there's no ghosts or possession involved in this story, even though Sam's dead grandmother is still very much at the forefront. And I think part of what makes this story so intriguing is that yes, on some level, strange and inexplicable things are happening, but a bigger part of that underlying fear is the fact that in some ways, the reintegration of her mother's values is something that Sam's mom is doing to herself. Granted, not because she wants to, but it's not like the walls are painting themselves. It's not like the old photographs are placing themselves around the house. It's this sense of, I'm so terrified of what's happening here that I'm willing to do this to myself. And that kind of brings me back to my point, which is that I really appreciate a haunted house story that can take that classic premise and use it to call forth and explore things like culture, family, generational trauma, colonialism, gender, and so many other unspoken things. That's not to say this story explores all of those things I just listed, those are just examples. What makes this story stand out in a sea of haunted house stories is that this repatriation of the house, so to speak, is about confronting the ways generational racism and generational sins cycle around and always find a way to surface. That's not to say Sam's mother or Sam herself are racist. In fact, they're very liberal-minded people. But it's about that tension between generations. It's about not wanting to have those difficult conversations with older folks who are quote-unquote set in their ways because they're old and considered to be harmless. But the long-standing legacies of those ideologies they uphold are anything but harmless and can actually outlast our lifetimes. I think that's why the generational divides being showcased in this story make it that much more fascinating, because the dynamic is different from one generation to the next. We see with Sam's mom how she tries to appease her dead mother's spirit and wishes because she thinks it's easier to take the path of least resistance. And then we see how Sam is dealing with the consequences of that choice, how pretending that something isn't real or isn't important doesn't actually make it go away. So I appreciate Sam being the hero of this multi-generational story, seeing how she's trying to forcefully reclaim agency over this family's narrative and legacy by actively challenging the past. Not merely trying to destroy it, but more importantly, actually confronting it for once. T. Kingfisher has such a great knack for taking images and objects that are not inherently sinister and gradually making them feel more and more unsafe, which I think really adds to the atmosphere of the story, and also that thematic interrogation of things that we collectively deem to be innocuous that are actually, in fact, dangerous. I'm sure you can tell, but I very much enjoyed this. It made me even more excited for the upcoming Thornhedge and also Kingfisher's backlist as well. This was an easy 5 stars. And the most recent short book I read that sort of fit into this accidental theme was Piñata by Leopoldo Gaut. This is an occult Latin horror story. It's about a Mexican-born architect named Carmen Sanchez who's traveling back to her homeland in Mexico to oversee a restoration project where her firm is converting an old abbey into a modern hotel. She doesn't want to leave her 2 daughters at home in New York, so she brings them along in hopes that this will be a chance for them to reconnect with their Mexican roots. However, one day when her daughters are shadowing her at the worksite, there's a horrible accident which unearths a stash of ancient artifacts hidden deep inside the abbey, which ends up cutting Carmen's assignment short. Not only that, but it seems like a dark and malevolent force may have followed the Sanchez family on their journey back. Content warnings for references to child death and femicide, explorations of colonization, colonial trauma, and forced religious indoctrination, instances of racism, colorism, and racist slurs, references to deportation, some ableist language, instances of bullying, depictions of graphic death, injury, body horror, and violence, as well as gun violence. The tagline for this book is A Head Full of Ghosts, which I haven't read, meets Hereditary, which is a fascinating combination, but then you layer in the fact that this is very much a Mexican horror story by a Mexican storyteller, and suddenly I'm very much interested. As I was saying before, this is another story where the past is violently forcing itself on the present, but in a way that centers colonization and its deeply traumatizing effects. This story has its roots in indigenous Mexican beliefs and stories, in particular those of the Nahua people who are indigenous to this construction site. I can't speak to how that's represented, of course, but I can say that I really appreciate those conversations happening in this story thematically, because so much of Mexican culture, like many colonial cultures, is based in indigenous beliefs, stories, foods, and even languages. History, specifically history as determined and perpetuated through a colonial lens, is like a great whetstone gradually sanding off the edges of indigenous influences, forcefully distilling those rich and fraught histories into one quote-unquote unifying narrative, to the point where we can't tell where colonial influences and indigenous influences begin and end, which is entirely the point. So that understanding of how modern Mexican culture takes so much of its trademark influences directly from indigenous cultures is a fundamental part of what makes this story so impactful, especially since our main character, Carmen, is Mexican herself. She was born in Mexico, she's from there, she speaks the language fluently and is familiar with the landscape, but in this specific instance, she is acting on behalf of the colonizer to reshape and commercialize this land, even though she may not be the person who created this project. I think that speaks to the ignorance so many of us can have when establishing ownership over our own culture. We think being of a place makes us an authority and means we can do no wrong in relation to that place or that culture, but often we can be implicit in enacting colonial violence against ourselves and our people, even just by being willfully ignorant. And this story is using horror to show how that ignorance can be dangerous. So even though the past is violently making itself known in this contemporary landscape, it feels different from your typical haunting because in most stories about being haunted, there's a clear moral divide between the undead and the haunted. Which is to say, when you see this evil force manifesting in the material world, it feels wrong, and you're hoping for the hero to either root out or escape that wrongness. And here, while the haunting force is absolutely unsettling and disturbing, it's really about how the past will not and should not be forgotten, which is both a threat and a promise. So it's a very subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. As I was reading this, I didn't necessarily need Carmen to triumph over this malleable force, but rather I was increasingly desperate for her to accept it, to name it, and to understand what it is and where it comes from and why. All of that said, I think this story definitely has its drawbacks. I think it's much longer than it needs to be, first off. I feel like it drags at some points, it gets a bit info-dumpy in clumsy ways, and in the last third it almost feels like the main plot isn't the central focus. The other thing I'm kind of hesitant about is that I'm not 100% confident this story does its indigenous roots justice, specifically given the resolution of this story. Again, it's not my place to comment on the authenticity of the story, the inspiration, the history explored here, so I'm not going to. I also don't know the author's personal stake in using those elements, which is not my business, but I'm also not fully convinced about the conclusions this story draws. Like I said, this story discusses colonization and colonial trauma a great deal, but I'm not sure if it fully reckons with the Sanchez family's participation in those same systems. Like, the things happening in this story literally happen because one of them takes something that does not belong to them, and I don't feel like the story reckons with that contradiction, especially as the peoples directly harmed by that choice are the same ones who are then tasked with saving the family from that curse. Obviously, I'm not going to spoil anything plot related, but the basic idea here is that there's an angry, spiteful, indigenous spirit intent on enacting violence, which also definitely could be read as a harmful stereotype depending on your perspective, and also getting its revenge on its oppressors. So the idea of banishing that spirit without fully acknowledging the oppressive systems and traumas it's responding to kind of makes the story feel incomplete. So honestly, I'm kind of torn about this one. There's really great ideas and conversations going on here. The story undoubtedly excels in showcasing vividly intense horror imagery and sequences that will stay with you long after the story ends, but those questionable aspects ultimately made me land on giving this 3 stars. But I might still check out his other work. In particular, I've heard really good things about Ghost Radio, and for the record, the audiobook is read by Pedro Pascal, so you are welcome for that little tidbit. So those are 3 short books I read recently. Again, they're all great choices for the Tor.comathon or any time of the year you so choose. If you've read any of these yourself, or if you plan to, or if you have any similar recs to these, I would love to see all of that down below in the comments. But that is everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.